Welcome to the Bare Marriage Podcast. I'm Sheila Ray Gregoire from baremarriage.com, where we like to talk about healthy, evidence-based biblical advice for your sex life and your marriage. And I'm back from vacation. We took May off because we had to frantically finish up some edits from our new marriage book, The Marriage You Want, which will be out next April in 2025. Sorry, we don't have it for you earlier. And then Keith and I took a vacation, a much needed one with my mom, and it was wonderful. And I just came back really refreshed and a lot more optimistic. I think I've been really sad for a long time because of the fight that we're in and the condition of the evangelical church. And I just realized, things are really changing. I just hear such wonderful things from so many people every day, and we're making a difference. And that doesn't mean that everything's going to change, but there's a huge movement happening. And I just feel like, we're finally getting through. So I think I turned a corner. My mental health is a ton better. And I'm really looking forward to the podcast that we have for you for the rest of the season. And today's is another kind of optimistic one because there's a bunch of new books coming out on healthy male sexuality and healthy masculinity in the Christian context. And today we are going to interview Sam Jolman, who's just written an awesome book on just that topic. So here is Sam. Well, I am so thrilled to bring to our podcast today Sam Jolman, who is a licensed counselor from Colorado Springs and who has a new book that launches tomorrow called The Sex Talk You Never Got, Reclaiming the Heart of Masculine Sexuality. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Sheila. Thank you for having me on.
I
Such a
am so
privilege.
excited. I am really honestly excited about this book. You gave me the opportunity to read an early copy, so thank you for that. I think I read it
Yes.
almost a year ago or in the fall or
You read it last fall, and you gave me the honor of being an early reader where you could actually give feedback yet, which was
yeah.
so helpful.
Yeah.
I wanted your thoughts and reflections on that.
Yes, I remember that. And I gave you an endorsement because I'm just so excited that there are so many amazing books coming out on
Mm,
healthy male sexuality
mm,
because we got to get
mm.
beyond the everyman's battle,
Yes.
people.
Yes.
Like we got to do this well. And
That's right.
you did it well. Like this is an
Oh,
awesome book. Everybody, you got to go
thank
look at
you.
the sex talk you never got. And we're gonna dive into it today. So are you ready?
That sounds great.
Okay, so you open the book by talking. Well, it's actually really interesting because one of the things that you say is that we're suffering from sexual malnourishment
Yes.
and real abandonment in male sexuality. And tell me what you
Yes.
mean by that.
Yeah. So, I think as men, we're very overly sexualized, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this sense of, men just want sex. Is it over sexualizing men? But we're under sexually nurtured, meaning like sexuality is probably the place you've had the few most meaningful conversations of your life. The fewest, right? It's the place you probably were left to figure it out on your own as a man.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Maybe you had locker room talk, um, or sex jokes, right? But most men didn't get much of a sex talk, maybe a purity lecture, maybe an shoddy anatomy lesson, but nothing more than that. And it's interesting, when I talk to guys about this book, it's almost universal. It just happened. I had a meeting for my son is going into junior high, and I saw another dad literally 2 nights ago, and we were catching up on life, and I said, I have a book coming out. Oh, that's awesome. What are you writing on? I told him the title, and the first thing out of his mouth, and this
Mm-hmm.
happens all the time, is, yeah, I didn't get a sex talk. I
Mm-hmm.
had to ask my friends in high school,
Mm-hmm.
and they got a bunch of things wrong, and their advice was terrible, and there's probably a lot of things I wanted to forget.
Yeah.
And that seems universal within the church, outside of the church. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
happened at the Verizon store with the 20-year-old who asked me, what's your business? Maybe we can get you a business line. I said, well, I'm an author, which always leads into what do you write
Mm-hmm.
on? So I said, the sex talk you never got. And he said, yeah, I didn't get a sex talk. My mom said, go ask your brother because we know
Oh,
your dad's not
wow.
going to talk to you.
Uh-huh.
Um, and he said, my brother got the anatomy wrong. He was just newly married. Um, and he trailed off with this sense of like, that led to a lot of mistakes or a lot of struggle. And of course, we quickly moved on to talking about the business line he wanted to sell me. But you're
Mm-hmm.
like, wow, right there is a whole story and a
Mm-hmm.
whole world that this guy's been alone in figuring out.
Yeah, and it's so true. Both men and women haven't had sex talks, but I think what's happened with men, and of course in our podcast we talk so much about women, but men have been really hurt by this too, is that the way that we've talked about their sexuality is just so ugly.
Yeah.
I mean, even
Right.
in Christianity, it is so ugly.
Yes.
The idea that in every man's battle that you just need sexual release and you need to use your wife as your methadone so that you can get that sexual release, as if the pull is just to ejaculation and nothing else.
Right. Right. It degrades men. It robs them
Hmm.
of anything other than um, you know, urges, right?
Yeah.
And this kind of monster animal view of sexuality within men.
Yeah. And which is funny because on our last podcast of the season, we were talking about that whole view of men as monsters. And it's just not true. It's not ever what
Yes.
God intended. Men can be strong, men are capable, all of these things, but there's also great beauty. And there's also great vulnerability, and there's also great love and desire and arousal, and all of these things are good things, and yet they've been so distorted in the way that we teach about sex. So that's why I'm so grateful that you're doing this. Now, in your practice, you must see the results of this all the time.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm a counselor. I work with men. I do sexual trauma recovery. I do marriage counseling. And it's wild. Most guys, this is changing. Thank God it's changing. But most guys come in when something's on fire in their life, like something's broken, their marriage isn't working, or they're stuck in struggle. But most guys don't come in saying, "Hey, I want to work on my story or engage my trauma or grow deeper." There are men that do. And again, that's
Hmm.
changing, which is really good. Um, but most of the time it's, them stuck in some sort of struggle like pornography, or
Hmm.
they've been caught in some illicit affair or something like that. Um, or things aren't working in their marriage. And that's usually where we start. And then we start to get into the layers, right? Of like, how did you get here? And there's
Hmm.
always a story of setup to how they got there. It's never just, well, I just struggle with lust like every man.
Right.
That's so simplistic of every man I've ever met with. That's never the story. Well, you just
Hmm.
you just lust, right? It's just sin.
Yeah.
It's always more complex. So we usually start to peel back the layers and get into the story of how did you get here?
Hmm.
And I'm always surprised. Most guys will say, as we start getting into the layers, oh yeah, there's that weird thing that happened when I was younger. And that always seems to be the word.
Hmm.
And or I plan to take this to my grave, something like that is usually how they preface stories of sexual trauma.
Right.
They don't hold it as trauma. They hold it as their shame. Something's weird. I'm the monster. I'm
Hmm.
I'm perverted. Something like that is usually how they start by telling their stories of sexual development, right? Because guys don't remain unformed. It's not like because you didn't get a talk, it just sits there, right? Something comes in, other forces come in to form us as men. It's not that every man has sexual abuse in his story,
Hmm.
but every man has forces that have formed him that have harmed him
Yeah.
in some way. Even if it's, like a lot of guys will tell me the story of how they first started watching pornography. And most of those stories are stories of somebody else introducing them to it, which
Hmm.
is a story of harm.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those getting guys to step into their story and realize like, whoa, it's not just me
Hmm.
struggling with lust and being perverted. There's actually all these other things that have shaped me sexually. That work is very rewarding because what happens is once we lose the monster or the perverted language, then we start to get to these really, I would say, beautiful and powerful places in men, which I talk about in the book, which I've called the lover heart of a man. That every man, and again, this, um, might make men roll their eyes, but every man is a lover at
Hmm.
heart. Um, we have pictures of this, like the guy that comes home from war and greets his family, right? And we could watch those videos all day on YouTube, right? Or TikTok, of the guy, of the surprise dad that comes home
Yeah.
from being on leave and like embraces his kids and they all break down crying. Like, what is that in a guy? That's his lover heart. It's him loving his family and loving the people around him. And I'm always surprised once you get past the monster language, um, you get to this lover heart of a man. Um, the other thing, I'll say this real quick too. The other thing that often happens in counseling is, obviously I get to work in a confidential environment, so guys can say whatever they want to me, but they'll say it like this. Um, I'm probably more like the woman in the relationship because I need the emotional stuff
Mm.
and I want the emotional stuff. Or like literally last week, a guy said to me, "Look, I know I'm supposed to always just be ready and always ready, and always able to get it up." But he said, "I actually need foreplay.
Hmm.
Like I want that stuff." Right. And what is wrong with our masculinity that he has to say it in a counseling office
Yeah.
confidentially to me?
Yeah. Or he has to apologize for wanting connection. Yeah.
Yes. Right.
Hmm.
Right. And almost say it embarrassed, or I guess I'm more like the woman. Like, what? What's
Hmm.
wrong with our masculinity that men have
Yeah.
to hide it?
Yeah. No, it's really interesting, and I really like your approach because what you're saying is we presented a very broken view of men's sexuality, both in the church and the culture, and you're not trying to like fix it as much as I love the word that you used to bless men's actual sexuality and to bring that out so that
Yes.
what's actually inside of us, the way that we were made, can come out. And I want to say too, just as a caveat, like. Um, we know that many men have committed great destruction in their marriages because
Yes.
of porn, and we're not trying to downplay that at all. It's just that over and over again, what's been shown is that the route to healing is not just to white knuckle it through and quit the porn. It's to actually get to the wounds and the shame and all of the things that have driven guys to use porn. And
Yes.
then that actually enables them to increase vulnerability, to increase authenticity, to get rid of the shame and to actually connect for the first time. And that's when porn loses its hold because so many guys, I hear it all the time. I try to quit, and then 2 weeks later, I'm in it again, and then 2 weeks later, I'm in it again, and it's because you haven't
Hmm.
dealt with the ugliness, you haven't dealt with the shame, right?
Right.
So that's what you're trying to get at, yeah.
Right.
And
Often,
I don't mean to put words in your mouth. I know this because I read your book, and I've heard this from so many others, but I really like that approach because it's so different from every man's battle, and it actually leads to wholeness, and I'm really appreciative of it.
yes. Yeah. I think a lot of guys end up trying to repent of having a body, period,
Hmm.
versus repenting of the sin that they've done with their sexuality.
Yeah,
Um, but that's a different story. You don't repent of your sexuality,
yeah.
you repent of your sin. And, for us to honor, sexuality was blessed in Eden
Hmm.
before the fall. Um, and, um, I think that's the picture presented to us. I was thinking, like, what are the most virile pictures of men in the Bible? And I would say Song of Songs,
Hmm.
and Adam in the garden. And again, you might argue with me on that. Like, but if you look at those two pictures, what happens with these men? What happens in the midst of their arousal? They break into poetry, right?
Yeah.
They're these poet lovers, um, that emerge from these guys. They write poetry.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying every man needs to become a poet, but that heart is in every man.
Yeah. You have this story about how so many guys are actually repenting of their bodies or their sexuality as opposed to, repenting of the sin. And you gave this illustration, it was so good, of this guy who's so proud of himself. It's like he won the purity culture trophy or something. And he's in this restaurant with his wife and saying that he doesn't even notice beautiful women anymore. They don't even register. And that was actually something that she felt sad about because if he can't notice beauty in other people, then how is he going to notice it in her? And how is he even going to relate to the world in an honest way?
Right.
And I thought that
Right.
was an interesting take.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this piggybacks off of your research that you did
Hmm.
in the Good Guys Guide. I'm going to slaughter the title. The Good
The Good
Guys
Guy's
Guide.
Guide to Great Sex. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Um but you talked about how purity culture sets men up to believe you're going to struggle. And
Hmm.
sure enough, I think you said like 78% had self-reported that they struggle.
Hmm.
And yet only like 33% of those guys or of the whole group of men actually showed, signs of lust.
Hmm.
Um, and so what's happening when a guy, sees a beautiful woman? Is that wrong? What happens in him? And I think purity culture says yes. Anything that moves in you, right? If you're standing next to a woman in Starbucks and you feel something that's wrong in you, and you need to, look away, bounce your eyes, shut it
Hmm.
down, run, whatever it is. Um, and what you said so well is no, you're just noticing beauty.
Hmm.
Um, and that's a good thing in you to notice beauty. In fact, that's what makes you a lover. That's what lets you notice a beautiful sunset,
Hmm.
or a beautiful piece of music. And so, yeah, this guy, it's actually a friend's dad,
Hmm.
and he was telling me this story, and yeah, he had said, I've conquered it. I've
Yeah.
shut down. I've succeeded in shutting down whatever is in me that moves in the presence of a beautiful woman. Therefore, I don't lust. And his wife felt sad at that, understandably, because he'd killed off something that
Hmm.
was meant to be there. The capacity to be moved is how we love.
Yeah. So, okay, I think a lot of people listening are going to be confused right now, though, because, and this is something that I have tried to explain in so many different ways. So I'm going to give you a chance to explain it now.
Okay.
But why is it that it is okay to notice that someone is good looking?
Yeah. So there's the difference between arousal and desire, right?
Okay.
Arousal, non-concordance,
Yes.
right? So what moves in your body is not the same as what moves in your heart necessarily.
Hmm.
Meaning arousal is not the same as desire. Desire is not the same as arousal. So, I think we could put what moves in a guy in the presence of beauty is a form of arousal.
Hmm.
It doesn't necessarily mean it leads to lust. What happens in his heart is kind of his decision.
Right.
Is he going to take it to lust and start to objectify, or is he going to take in um, what he's beholding?
Hmm.
And I don't mean stare necessarily, but just be able to acknowledge and even thank God, as I say in the book, for beauty.
Yeah. And not just
Um,
beauty in other people's bodies, but beauty in like a tree in the autumn or in the mountain or in a
yes,
gorgeous lake. Like just we can be in awe of beauty.
yes, right. And as I say in the book, Eugene Peterson says, awe leads to worship,
Hmm.
right? And so, taking in the beauty of the world is what leads us to want to thank God for
Yeah.
life itself. Um, I was talking to a friend who was watching, the women's March Madness, and he was telling me like, I can't stop watching Caitlin Clark play basketball.
Hmm.
And he was kind of wrestling this out loud with me. He's like, it doesn't feel like lust,
Hmm.
but I can't stop watching. She's so good.
Yeah.
And so I said to him, that's awe.
Yeah.
You're being moved, not, and again, not just by her physical beauty,
Hmm.
even, right? But her skill and
Hmm.
finesse as an athlete. Um, that's another form of being moved. That's different than lust, right? There was a kind of reverence. He even described it that way. He's like, I can't describe it. It's like I'm just moved by her.
Yeah.
And her skill. I just loved watching.
Yeah. I think we have an easier time understanding this if we reverse the genders because most women will say, "Oh yeah, I noticed that the guy was good looking," or I noticed that, he was really muscular, really strong. But we don't think of that as lust. But if a
Right.
guy notices that a woman is appreciates that she's good looking or something, we
Hmm.
interpret that as lust because we're so used to men approaching sexuality through that desire to consume,
Right.
that desire to own or whatever,
Right.
objectify, that we assume that is lust when a woman could do the exact same thing and we wouldn't assume that was lust.
Right.
So if you're struggling with this as a woman, if you're like, but I don't want him to notice other women, we're not saying lust. We're just talking about it in the same way that you might notice a really good looking guy. Like Ryan Reynolds is the example I always use because he's a really good looking Canadian man. Okay. So, you know, and I can acknowledge that. That is a really good looking Canadian man. If he showed up at my door and said, Sheila, I want to embrace you, I would say, I would call the police. Right. Like,
Right.
it doesn't mean I might try to get his autograph first, but I would call the police, like it doesn't mean that I want to do anything with him or
Right.
anything like that.
Right.
Um, you can just notice that, hey, he's good looking, end of story. And that's as far as it goes. I can laugh at the way that he talks about his daughters on Twitter because that's quite funny. And appreciate things about him, but it doesn't mean that it's anything to do with lust or desire. Right.
Right. I had a woman client say to me one time, she said, "Oh, I notice guys. I see guys noticing me, like in the
Mm-hmm.
grocery store line, for example." She says, "Oh, I see guys noticing me." And she said it flatters me,
Mm-hmm.
to have a man appreciate my beauty and see him, catching my eye or whatever. And then she paused and she said, "But then there are those other looks,
Mm-hmm.
the creepy ones." And she said those feel horrible. So she
Yes.
was able to hold this difference between a guy that she could tell she had a felt sense of, a guy that was noticing her beauty versus a
Mm-hmm.
guy that was obviously objectifying her or lusting or taking it further. And there was a
Mm-hmm.
felt difference for her.
Yeah.
That spoke to me as powerful, like, wow, okay.
Mm-hmm.
It tells me something different can happen in a man's heart than just lust, right? This can be something else that might actually be a gift
Mm-hmm.
or at least appreciated, right? She said, I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think that and that's a lot of what you're trying to do sort of at the beginning of the book is to show that our appreciation of beauty in all its forms, not just in someone's body, but in all its
Right.
forms, it leads us to awe, it leads us to worship, it leads us to gratitude. It's one of the conduits through which, we do approach God is through appreciation of beauty. Um, and and this is how we can start to reclaim our sexuality. Like the way that we reclaim male sexuality is not to make men feel like they are wrong if they ever notice beauty. It's to make men put that in perspective and
Yes.
honor it instead of try to consume it, right? And
Yes.
and that's the rub because we've often done this so badly.
Right.
And I think part of the way that we do it badly is because of shame, right?
Yes.
And we attach shame to so much of our sexual feelings. You quoted Dan Allender who called shame the fear of exposure, which I thought was very interesting.
Yes.
So can you explain the role that shame plays in our sexuality?
Yes. I think we could say we all, what is shame? It's the fear of exposure. It's the fear of eyes, really. We
Mhm.
we all want to be seen,
Mhm.
right? Like we all want to be seen as a way we talk about love. Like I felt so seen might be a way you describe feeling loved in a moment. But shame is I felt so exposed or I felt so
Mm.
naked or um I could feel people's eyes on me, right? And it feels horrible. That's a different feeling than feeling loved, right?
Right.
And I think, as I said in the book, I think evil's greatest goal is to join shame to our sexuality.
Mhm.
So that we do what? We shut it down or we split from it. And I
Mhm.
think this is where so many men get stuck is right. Nobody took the time to talk to them about their sexuality. They got lost in a story. Maybe they were harmed. Um, and evil starts to introduce shame to their story. And then what? Well, then they push it away into the shadows of their being. So
Mhm.
it's a thing that lives kind of in silence or secrets and or kind of split off, we could say, from the rest of them. It kind of operates over here, which I think is what evil wants, because what can it do then? It can tempt you um, to act out of your shame or your stories of shame. Um, If you think about the Garden of Eden, it's a horrible transition. We have chapters and verses in our modern Bibles. But if you read it as, they didn't have chapters and verses in the original. So if you read it as in a flow, right, that scene of Adam with Eve, they were naked and felt no shame.
Mm-hmm.
Now the serpent. It's literally the next words. In other words, that's how quickly evil comes to try to harm that naked vulnerability of obviously their sexuality, but more their relationship and their openness, their vulnerability, their intimacy with each other. So you know, I think evil wants to do that exact same thing in all of our stories is join your sexuality to shame so that you do what? You shut it down, you disconnect from it, you push it in the shadows. It operates over here in a place you don't want to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is really interesting imagery because if intimacy is truly being seen and shame is feeling exposed like like people see too much, then that really means that you can't be intimate. Like
Right.
it gets rid of the chance for intimacy. And what I found so interesting, this is one of the big takeaways I have of your book, is how shame and contempt are linked. I mean, I've done a lot of work on shame and have read a ton about it, but
Yeah.
I hadn't seen that link in the same way.
Mm.
And you explained it really well how the cause of your shame or the root of your shame, whatever caused you to be exposed, is what you now have contempt on. And you act that out.
Yes.
Can you explain how that works to me?
Yeah. So, we actually don't stay in shame very long.
Hmm.
Shame feels deadly, right? Like we even have that language of I felt so mortified or I could have died, right? I felt so exposed, right? We talk like that. But it's actually true that you stay in shame for about zero point 0.8 seconds and then you need to get out of it because nobody can bear exposure. Um,
Hmm.
Emily Nagoski says shame is actually it induces a stress response like
Hmm.
fight or flight. Um, like you're in the presence of a bear, only it's actually a flight from yourself
Hmm.
because you feel like you're the danger, like
Hmm.
something's wrong with me. I need to run from myself. And so we have to do something to get out of shame. And as I say in the book, the quickest, sadly, probably the most overly used response is to go to contempt.
Yeah.
We again to borrow Dan Allender's words, we try to gouge out the eyes looking at us,
Hmm.
or we try to get away, and that's proverbial, obviously. But we try to shut down the person who's seeing us, or we try to get away from that part of ourselves by disowning it, disconnecting from it. Um, and shame, contempt restores a sense of power
Hmm.
when we feel powerless. And so we'll rise up with some form of contempt. You think about, like if I think about, losing my keys in the house, um, I, I can feel tempted. I can feel attacked with shame, right? Like, man, I'm an adult man. I just lost my keys, you know? Um, and can you start to hear the shame voice, right? So what will I do? I'm tempted often to call myself an idiot. Oh, you're
Hmm.
such an idiot. Why can't you remember your keys? Right? That little moment of contempt helps me get out of my shame. Or
Hmm.
I might say, who took my keys? Right? To my boys. I have three boys. Or my wife, right? Like somebody took my keys. Where did you guys put them? Or
Hmm.
like, you can just some way of acting out of that feeling of exposure to restore a sense of power.
Hmm. So what does that look like in the bedroom?
Great question. You think about the vulnerability of asking for sex.
Hmm.
So let's say a man is interested in sex, and so he asks his wife, "Hey, can we make love?" Right? Do you just hear the vulnerability of desire?
Hmm.
So if he's struggling with shame about his desire, he might resort to coercion. You owe me sex, or sex is an obligation, as you talk about so well, right? The
Hmm.
obligation sex message, in a way, it gives a man a sense of power or control so he doesn't have to deal with his vulnerability.
Right.
Um, so it could be manipulation. Um, I had a woman client, and she's given me permission to share this part of her story, but she said, um, I always knew my husband had a bad day based on how he would have sex with me that night.
Mm-hmm.
And she said it felt like I was the thing he needed to conquer because his day went so bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was, and which is such a painful experience that she's describing. Rather than it being a form of making love, he's obviously had a shameful day, like he didn't get enough work done or something didn't go well. And so he comes home and makes sex the power thing, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
contemptuous.
Yeah.
It's not there to connect the two of them.
Yeah.
Um, or a guy that I tell a story in the book, and this name has been changed, but a guy named Tom who, after feeling rejected by his wife, um, and not wanting to engage the vulnerability of asking for sex, turned to pornography,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because pornography is a place of, among other things, empowerment, right? It
Yep.
feels like I don't have to be vulnerable.
Yep.
I get to have the power. So
Yep.
it's a form of contempt, and we don't often think of that. It's not just, I would say it's never just a guy like, oh, he's just got too much sexual desire and he doesn't know where to go with it, right? That's not pornography.
Mm-hmm.
That's not why men use pornography. Um, Men use pornography because um, it's a place to go act something out. We even have that language. I would say among other things, it's a place to feel power.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually found the story of Tom really moving because you worked through it and you showed how he treated his wife so terribly, by turning to porn and other things, but there was a root to it.
Yes, right. So Tom was one of those guys that I talked about earlier, who came in, didn't know the layers, said, I'm struggling with pornography. He's a Christian,
Hmm.
and rightfully so, he felt conviction about that. And I can't seem to stop. I pray all the time.
Hmm.
Um, and I just can't get over it. I don't know what's going on. Am I even a Christian? Was even his question, and we got into the layers of his story. Um, and he's also given me permission to share this. But he told the story of he was a very happy and jovial kid, and he would always go to his father at night before he would go to bed and give his father a kiss and a hug. Um, Again, just the overflow of his heart that God
Hmm.
made him with. And at age 7, he's doing the same nightly routine. He gets his pajamas on, brushes his teeth, comes down to his dad, and his dad halts him as he comes to kiss him and says, um, something like, "Aren't you? You're too old for that now." I
Hmm.
think was the line, and said, "We need to stop."
Hmm.
And he's caught in this agony of what?
Hmm.
And it doesn't make sense. And can you start to hear, in that moment, the voice of shame came to him, which
Yeah.
was, something's wrong with me if I want affection.
Hmm.
Um, and he remembers as a boy feeling that rejection from his dad and shutting down, and that actually ended his father's affection for him that day. Um, and he felt immense shame for that desire for affection. It was only later that he learned, and again, you start to just hear how generations of trauma can pass on. Obviously, his father's responsible for what he said, but he found out later that his father at age 7 was sent to an orphanage because his father's single mother was overwhelmed
Hmm.
and at the time didn't know what to do and sent him to an orphanage. So at age 7, his father's affection had stopped. And you just think about the trauma of that. And yet, without being dealt with, he just harmed his son, reenacted what had happened to him,
Hmm.
which is tragic.
And I'm now picturing Tom, how he still has this innate desire that we all have to connect and to be seen. But every time he feels that, he needs to shut it down. And so every time he feels like he
Yes.
wants to be close to his wife, he's almost drawn to porn because it's a way to escape this feeling of wanting to connect, which is scary, right?
Right.
Like it's just such a terrible cycle. It's such an
Right.
awful cycle.
Right. Right. And again, we're not saying he's not responsible for his choices, right?
Hmm.
But he
Hmm.
did the right choice, which was turn to counseling, get help,
Yeah.
ask the deeper question. Don't
Yeah.
just keep trying to get over your porn use, um, and end up never being curious about why it might be there.
Yeah.
Where did it start?
Because so often our stories, our sexual stories, our stories of ourselves, our stories of who we are, really do impact these ways that we often act out in ways that we don't like. And it's not always with sex. It could be with, whether or not you drink, your relationship with food, your relationship with how
Right.
you raise your kids. Like it's all intertwined and we all have to look at our stories. But it's just so interesting how the area of sex is so often the one that evil targets.
Yes.
Um, and because it's so close to us, and because it's just marring something which was meant to be beautiful. And
Right.
so, we've talked about a lot of the ugly stuff, the shame, the contempt, the porn, etc. But I love the picture that you present in the sex talk you never got, which, as I said, launches tomorrow. So I think this podcast is coming out on June 6th. If we read it later, then it's already launched. So you can go get it on Amazon or christianbooks.com or wherever you get books right now. Um, but I love how you talk about sex as play.
Yes.
And can you tell me about that?
Yes. So that was really fun in my writing to discover, you know, the question of like, what is sex? What is its essence, right? Is it a thing in itself, or is it kind of a thing that draws together other ways we're formed? And I say in the book, I'm convinced that sex is actually a form of play
Hmm.
in itself. And I came to that by just reading through these books on play and discovering that sex really follows the rules of play, right? These elements of play. For example, like, I have a 7-year-old son, and it's literally every day that he asks me, "Hey, Dad, want to play?" Right? And it's such a beautiful question, probably the best question I get asked all day. And what's he doing? If you think about it, he's asking for consent,
Hmm.
right? Now, we would say, well, what? Right? Because we don't think about that in terms of play. But, Dad, do you want to play? Children know this, right? Play has to be invited, has to be drawn out, and somebody has to say yes or no
Hmm.
to play. And that's actually an element of play. That play, by command, actually stops it from being play. That's one of the things I read in a book by Johann Huizinga on play. Um, in other words, you can't be forced to play,
Yeah.
or it no longer is play.
You go play with your little sister. Yeah.
Right, right, and have fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
And actually, professional sports athletes feel this, right? Like the toll of it doesn't feel like play because I'm having to perform.
Mhm.
Um, and when I read that, I thought instantly of, oh, that's consent,
Yeah.
right? And because consent is not just what can I get away with, right? It's consent is inviting desire. It's
Yeah.
invitational. Want to
Yeah.
play?
Mhm.
Um, could be a way we invite sex uh between couples. In other words, it's drawing out desire where somebody gets to say yes or no.
Right. Right.
And
I,
you know, as I say in the book, we obviously have a lot of bad associations with play and sex. And I walk through those in the book that I feel like evil has really held
mhm.
that word play connecting to sex, right? Playboy, being toyed with,
Mm.
um, you know, uh, a player, um, cheating, even the language of somebody cheating on their spouse, right? It's play language, right? Cheating in a game,
Mhm.
um, or the shame that we invoke by, talking about masturbation as playing with yourself,
Yeah.
right? Like evil has kind of held this word in the realm of sexuality. And I'm trying to fight to get it back,
Right.
um, in the book.
Because I think of play as something which, yeah, I love your idea of consent, and that someone initiates the play, running next door and knocking on the door. Hi, Mrs. Robinson, can Julie come out and play? Like, you do when you're a kid or whatever. But I also think of like laughter and where you're not particularly self-conscious. Like play is just erupts from you out of joy, and you
Right.
explore and you make up new games, you make up new worlds or whatever you
Right.
kid. Um, but it just comes out of innocent imagination and fun that you want to experience with someone else. And that's lovely.
Right. And spot on. And in the book, I think sex is meant to draw out that kind of childlike
Hmm.
innocence and wonder and play, that we so lose. And, I think we often equate innocence with naivete,
Hmm.
right? It's, oh, right, you outgrow that. But I think innocence is meant to be the picture of healthy sexuality, right? That there's a kind of restored sense of wonder and awe and playfulness,
Hmm.
um, and innocence to how you show up.
Right. And then you go on to talk about arousal, which we've already touched on a little bit, but how like our attitude toward life can be one of inviting arousal. And we're not talking about like I'm not getting an erection or sexual arousal. That's not what you mean. It's just your attitude of being moved by what's around you.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So, um, I talk about the importance of developing a capacity for beauty.
Hmm.
And one of the things I'm trying to instill in my boys, and that they used to roll their eyes, but it's really cool to see actually now they are the first ones to start this practice. But when we see like a beautiful sunset, or since we live in Colorado, you drive down a road and you turn a corner and there's this just awe-inspiring view of a mountain.
Hmm.
And I said, it's my goal to instill in my boys a capacity for beauty
Hmm.
and wonder, because that's the good stuff of life
Yeah.
that we all live for, right? Like, you work for what? For the beauty, the beautiful moments of life, the loving moments of life. So it can be beauty in a relationship, but beauty in the world,
Hmm.
beautiful moments of conversation, beautiful music, um, that those things actually shape our hearts to be able to take in the beauty of a person and the beauty of sex with a person, your
Hmm.
spouse. Um, and so, yeah, a general posture of, again, I'm not trying to say all of life is sexual,
Yeah.
right? It's not, but all of life, as I say in the book, is sensual.
Yes.
And those are different. Like, you taste, touch, sight, smell, hearing, all of those things are given to you to take in the world.
Hmm.
Um, you think about just the simple um, thing God did by giving us, I think it's like 4,000 nerve endings in your tongue,
Hmm.
right? That's not just, obviously that's there to make sure things aren't too hot,
Yeah.
or to taste if things are rotten, right? So there's a protective element, but largely that's there just for the pleasure
Hmm.
of life. Um, and so I talk about, you know, a sensual posture or an aroused posture. Arousal is a term neurologically, that describes a person who's awake and
Hmm.
alive, not just sexually aroused. Sexual arousal fits in that,
Yeah.
but that
But
you're
it's bigger
alert.
than that. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like you're awake, you're alive, you approach life with gratitude, with awe, all of these wonderful things. And it's just amazing how much we've really clamped down on that. Feeling like, you're not allowed to feel, right? Men aren't supposed to
Yes.
feel, men aren't supposed to see, men aren't supposed to do any of these things. They just kind of have to be strong and aloof and emotionless. And that's not the picture of a lover.
Right. 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 In fact, Cole Arthur author Riley, I'm hoping
Hmm.
I'm getting her name right. She has this quote in her book, This Here Flesh,
Hmm.
and she talks about an arrogant man can't be moved by beauty.
Mm.
That, um, I'm not saying necessarily an arrogant man is the opposite of a lover, but you can see an arrogant man, a narcissistic man, um, doesn't want anybody to have power over them.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, they don't want and they won't let even beauty to overpower them. There's a desire to remain unmoved or
Mm-hmm.
to exert power over what's moved them. Um, and obviously that's an extreme, right? An arrogant or narcissistic man, but it's a picture for us of like, um, you know, beauty is powerful
Mm-hmm.
and it's meant to undo you. Um, and that takes a certain kind of humble hearted lover posture in a man to be able to
Yeah.
do that.
One of the things I frequently get emailed about is issues about libido. And a lot of people have this question. They say, Sheila, I've been listening to your podcast, I've been reading your book, and one of the things that you keep saying is that when marriages are healthy, when couples feel close, frequency tends to take care of itself. But I still don't have much of a libido. And I just want to address this quickly because I think I have something that can help. Yes, frequency does tend to take care of itself, but that doesn't mean it's always that case. There's still, 10, 15% of low libido that we can't explain looking at porn use, looking at past trauma, etc. And so we do have a course called Boost Your Libido, which can help people who are in otherwise good marriages who do reach orgasm regularly. So that's not the issue, but who just don't seem to want it and don't really think they have much of a libido. So you can check out our Boost Your Libido course. The link is in the podcast notes. It's also on our website under courses. We have a libido course and other courses too. But if that is you, if you're listening to this podcast and saying, I really do love my husband and I really do enjoy sex, but I just never seem to want it, then please check out Boost Your Libido, because wouldn't it be wonderful if sex actually was something that you yearned for? So the link is in the podcast notes, and I hope that helps. Yeah, I'm just thinking too, if you're not able to be moved by beauty, like you said, because beauty actually um, does awaken your vulnerability, because you feel like you can't have mastery over this because it in some way has mastery over you because you're in awe
Yes.
of it, right?
Right.
So if we don't like that feeling, then that's when we have to exert power. And that's where we see so much ugliness
Right.
coming into the idea of sexuality, is because I need to always be in control. I need to always have power. And if you feel like you need to always be in control, like you can't ever be moved by anything, you can't ever be vulnerable, you can't ever be truly seen because it will leave you too exposed, then yeah, you're going to be drawn toward pornography, or you're going to be drawn towards forms of sex that don't allow you to connect.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
sex becomes something which is purely mechanical, purely physical.
Mm-hmm.
You're using her to get your sexual release, as Emerson Eggerichs talks about in Love and Respect, but it's nothing to do with actually experiencing this with her, because
Right.
that's too vulnerable, right? You might
Right.
be seen and you have
Right.
to separate yourself so you're not seen. And yeah.
Right. Well said. Why do pornography scripts have such a misogynistic power element to them?
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's
Mm-hmm.
this very thing. It's scripting for men. You can be sexual and not have to be
Mm-hmm.
humble. You can be
Right.
sexual without having to lose your power. Even the act of viewing pornography keeps you in the power seat. And I read a report that pornography, the orgasm gap in pornography in terms of
Yeah.
the scripts of pornography is like 80+%.
Yeah.
Right? If that doesn't tell us, this is a script of power. It's not
Yeah.
just a script of beauty and arousal and all the good things, right?
Well, especially
Because
with how violent so much pornography is today,
yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes, well said. Right. That the majority becomes hardcore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what is that about? Well, it's a script for men to stay in power, because genuine sex, like you're saying, requires being undone.
Mm-hmm.
Requires being able to take in. And again, I want to make clear, we're not just saying beauty superficially here.
Mm-hmm.
As I say in the book, there's a guy, Dacher Keltner, who wrote a book on awe, and he describes this idea. He said in his research, what most brings people to awe is something he describes as moral beauty.
Mm-hmm.
It's people living with courage or overcoming hardship or suffering difficult circumstances and and staying alive through it and overcoming.
Hmm.
He says that's actually what brings us the greatest sense of awe. And so again, we have a very emaciated, especially as men, a very emaciated, superficial view of beauty, which is it's hot people, right?
Hmm.
And which just so emaciates again the lover heart of every man. Because what is beauty? Again, as my friend said, you know, he was taking in, I would say, the beauty of Caitlin Clark
Hmm.
in her incredible athleticism,
Hmm.
right? That's what he was in awe of. And I would put that in the category of a kind of moral beauty. She's overcoming hardship and rising on, obviously on a basketball court, but that's what we're meant to be attracted to in each other.
Yeah.
And especially between a husband and wife as lovers.
Yeah. Yeah. When we're attracted to their heart and not just yeah, the outside of them. And I've heard so many men, or so many men have written to me saying, my wife is now 4 months postpartum and her body doesn't look the way it used to, but I think it looks even more beautiful because when I look at the stretch marks, she got those giving me my daughter. And I love my daughter so
Yes.
much. So to me, she's even more beautiful, but she doesn't feel like she's beautiful.
Right.
And I'm trying to convince her that I don't want the old body back. I am happy. Like
That's
I
right.
am in awe of what she is now because, those scars mean something. Those marks mean something.
Yes.
And
That's well said.
I think that's such a lovely way of putting it. And because I know so many women, we've really got such body image issues because of the terrible view of beauty and the very narrow view that our society has put women in,
Mhm.
largely because of power plays. Um, but it doesn't need to be that way, and that's not the way the Bible talks about beauty. That's not what you're talking about in your book about embracing awe. I think it's just embracing, yeah, the beauty in relationships, the beauty um, in someone who, like, I think about my husband, who's often on call, not as much anymore, but he'd be on call all weekend and he'd have to sit with parents as he
Mm.
delivered bad news. And that just took such a lot of courage and a lot of compassion. And he'd
Right.
be exhausted. But that was a beautiful thing that he did.
Right.
It's a hard job that he has. And I just
Right.
so much appreciated that of him. And like that's what
Yeah.
moved me towards arousal, desire, whatever words you want to put on
Yes.
it. Not his mustache or his beard, although I like them, but like, you know, but, but yeah, just his heart for people, I think
Ah,
is and men are the
that's so
same
good.
way. They
Right.
are like they're
Right.
the same way.
Right. Like you bring up birth, and I think, I watched my wife birth three man children, these three boys that we have. And um I wept all three births. Um just it was like an experience now I can name as awe of like, wow, just watching her dig deep
Mhm.
to get it done, right? To birth
Yeah.
these children and connect to something primal. I mean, it was like, oh my goodness. Like she's almost, again, I'll use this word, transfigured,
Hmm.
right? I'm not trying to use that in a theological sense, but maybe a little,
Yeah.
like there was something more about her glory or
Yeah.
her beauty, that just watching her dig deep and do that, those were holy moments that I'll never forget. And it made me break down and cry, with the doula.
Yeah.
Like, wow, she's doing it. She's getting it done. Um, but there's other moments, it's not just birth. When I watch her, um, just like a deep conversation with her about reflections on a book she's read.
Hmm.
And when I catch like her unique perspective on a topic,
Yeah.
it's like, whoa, that's beautiful in her to see her
Yeah.
do that. Or my wife tells really good jokes and she has a really fun sense of humor, and like it's so attractive to me. Just
Yeah.
that playful side of her.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah. I love that. Well, do you, okay, I have a final question. which is the one that haunts me every night. But
Mm.
you're writing this book into a culture, an evangelical culture, which hasn't had a good script for sexuality for men.
Yeah.
And more voices are speaking up, which is wonderful.
Yes.
Um, but do you think things are changing? Like, what gives you hope
Mm.
as you look for the future?
I hope things are changing. The whole reason I wrote this book was because I'm bringing up three sons and um, thinking like I have got, to figure out what this is meant to look like. And it became a book, but that hunger to see the next generation of men raised up with a different script, especially a different sexual script, um, is really what drove me to do this. What gives me hope? Um, it's when you talk about getting the emails, I get the guys that come into my office and um time and again, I mean, literally, think I could say every man that sticks around in therapy, we get to this stuff and he finds his heart. And just knowing it's possible, that, I mean, my clients endlessly inspire me in that way, and watching them, um you know, a mini revolution, maybe it's their
Mhm.
life, right? But how they show up differently in their life, that kind of revolution. I mean, it is other writers, um, the ones that you've hosted, in their books, and seeing this kind of rising voice saying, you know, no, we're not just monsters. What? And understandably, the culture's been asking that question after like the Me Too movement. Are men
Mhm.
just fundamentally broken?
Yeah.
Um, but it gives me hope that um, I see, as many as there are men that make the headlines for being monstrous. Um, the kind of conversations that I hear happening out of that, of men that are counteracting that, it does give me hope.
Yeah. That's great. I do. I have hope too. I really do. And I get
Yeah,
them, yeah, from my emails and just yeah, seeing that some of the old scripts are going away, hearing pastors preaching good sermons on this stuff. I get sent YouTube
yeah,
videos. Look what my pastor said this week, and so I think things are changing because people want a different script.
right,
Nobody
right,
wants this whole men only need physical release, men aren't really emotional. Nobody wants that. Not
right,
really. It's
right.
everyone knows that's so shallow and such a shadow of what God created us to be. Um, and so I hope hope it will change for the next generation. I hope it'll change for
Yeah,
your sons. I hope
yes,
I hope as they get older, you'll have fun giving them multiple sex talks because it isn't one talk, it is
that's
multiple,
right.
it's a relationship. Yeah, and bless you for that. So where can people find you?
Yes. So you can go to my website, samjolman.com. There's no E in Jolman. Or I'm on Substack. Would love to have you join that. It's free. You can read my articles for free. And then, of course,
I think we're gonna run one of your articles next week actually because I really,
oh,
really
that's
liked
great.
it. I read it a while ago when you were talking about, oh, it's just a joke, how men often say that about sexist jokes, and
Yes.
why no, 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 no. Hold on a second. So I think I'm gonna
Yeah.
run that sometime next week. So yeah, stick around for that. Yeah.
Great. And then,
Mhm.
of course, would love you to buy the book, and would love your feedback on the
Yeah,
book.
so the book again is The Sex Talk You Never Got.
Yeah.
It is in stores tomorrow. If you order it on Amazon, often they ship it out even before it releases, so they'll probably ship it today
Yeah.
anyway. Um,
Yes.
and I will put links to your Substack and your website too on the podcast notes. So thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you, Sheila. This was such a pleasure.
I so appreciated that interview, and I just appreciate the many men who are coming on board on this movement and saying, "Hey, it's not just women who deserve better; men deserve better too. We all deserve better because we've all been hurt by this rhetoric that doesn't look anything like Jesus." And so, pick up his book. The link is in the podcast notes. I'm so excited about that. Now, I have something that I need to do as we are ending this podcast because the very last thing I said as we ended the last season was that we had a wonderful message from a pastor, and I really wanted to end the podcast season with this 1.5-minute clip from this great pastor from Texas. And unfortunately, that clip didn't make it in the first version of the podcast. We quickly replaced it, but I think a lot of the podcast platforms didn't refresh. And so even though it is correct on our podcast platform, it wasn't on a lot of others. And I just really appreciated what this pastor had to say. This was Pastor Joey Willis from New River Fellowship in Hudson Oaks, Texas. And I spoke there earlier this spring. And this is how he introduced the women's conference. And I just thought his words were so great. And as we are talking about healthy masculinity, let's let Joey end this podcast for us too. And we will see you again next week on the Bare Marriage Podcast.
Hey ladies, welcome to Woven 2024. My name is Joey and I'm the lead pastor here at New River. And I want to thank you for choosing to spend your weekend with us. Our teams have prayed into this weekend and sought out how to best encourage, equip, and empower you. We do believe that God has a plan for you and it can start today. But before we go any further, I want to make one thing clear, that women are called and equipped by God to lead and love at every level of leadership in the church, home, and the world. And no matter where you come from, what you were taught in your past, or what you believe about yourself today, know that we affirm you and celebrate you as an equal in God's creation. He designed you to be co-heirs with men and reign and rule together. And today is the day that you should believe it too. So on behalf of any church or pastor that may have ever hurt you, I want to repent. I want to say that I'm sorry for the ways the church has undervalued you, held you back, and expected you to remain silent when God has given you a voice that matters. You matter. Christ in you matters. So don't hold back this weekend. Step into the plans that God has for you. The church needs women like you, and it can start right now.